My name is Lily. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with the same quiet words: steady, reasonable, the one who keeps things together. I work in a role that rewards composure and consistency, the kind of job where people trust you because you don't make noise. Friends say I'm calm, family says I'm easy, strangers usually don't notice me at all, and that used to feel like a compliment. I've learned that when people underestimate you, they often confuse silence with agreement. They assume calm means compliance. They assume that because you don't raise your voice, you don't feel the weight of what's being said. For a long time, I let them believe that. It was simpler. It kept things smooth. This story isn't about revenge, and it's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about a single moment that looks small from the outside and enormous from the inside. I hung up on my father mid-argument. That was the last time I heard his voice. When people hear that, they expect drama or a villain or a neatly packaged lesson. There isn't one. There's only a sequence of ordinary choices that quietly added up. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This isn't a story where someone wins and someone loses. It's not about dominance through destruction. It's about the kind of power that comes from realizing, too late, that some moments don't come back. I was angry for 5 minutes. I've regretted it for years. That sentence is the spine of everything that follows. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through how I became the person my family relied on but rarely listened to. How small dismissals can feel harmless until they form a pattern. How silence can start as self-control and slowly turn into distance. And how a single unplanned decision, made without cruelty, without shouting, can still carry irreversible weight. There will be no dramatic confrontations here, no raised voices replayed for effect. What I'm offering is honesty, the kind that sits with discomfort instead of decorating it. I'll talk about the role I was assigned without asking for it, the moment I stepped out of that role, and the consequences that followed, some immediate, some that unfolded quietly over the years. If you've ever believed that keeping the peace was the same as doing the right thing, if you've ever told yourself, "I'll deal with this later," and assumed later would always be available, then you may recognize parts of yourself in this story. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm asking you to listen the way I didn't know how to listen back then. And maybe ask yourself, gently, is there a conversation in your life you're assuming you can always return to? To my family, I was the reasonable one, not the favorite, not the difficult one, not the one whose moods everyone tiptoed around. I was the one you called when something needed to be handled without fuss, forms filled out, schedules rearranged, apologies made on behalf of someone else. I was useful in the way furniture is useful. You notice it when it's gone, but you don't thank it for being there. My father liked to say I was low maintenance. He meant it as praise. What it really meant was that I didn't ask much from him. I didn't push. I didn't argue loudly. When he interrupted me, I stopped talking. When he corrected my memory of things I had lived through, I let it slide. I told myself it wasn't worth the effort. Growing up, I learned quickly that being agreeable earned me space. Not affection. Space. Space to exist without causing tension. My siblings filled the room in louder ways. They fought, rebelled, demanded. I adapted. I became efficient with my emotions. I edited myself in real time. If someone forgot my birthday, I laughed it off. If someone talked over me at dinner, I finished my sentence internally and moved on. If my father dismissed my concerns with, "You're overthinking it," I nodded, even when I knew I wasn't. People confuse adaptability with strength. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just survival dressed up nicely. From the outside, our family looked functional. No scandals, no screaming matches that neighbors whispered about. Holidays happened on schedule. Phone calls ended with "love you," even when nothing meaningful had been said. I played my part well. I was the bridge, the translator, the emotional shock absorber. And because I was so good at it, no one ever asked how heavy it was. My father, especially, saw me as dependable, but secondary. He trusted me with logistics, not with feelings. When decisions were made, I was informed after the fact. When opinions were asked for, mine was treated like a formality, something polite to acknowledge, easy to override. I don't think he did it maliciously. That's the hardest part to explain. There was no single moment where he was cruel enough to justify walking away. There was just a steady erosion, 1,000 small reminders that my role was to accommodate, not to challenge. When friends met my family, they often told me, "You're so lucky, your dad is so confident, such a strong personality." I smiled when they said that. I didn't know how to explain that confidence feels different when it's always pointing away from you. I told myself stories to make it easier. He's from a different generation. He doesn't mean it the way it sounds. He shows love by providing, not by listening. Those explanations worked until they didn't. What no one noticed was how carefully I learned to disappear without actually leaving. I could be in the room and absent at the same time. I could agree without consenting. I could say, "It's fine," and mean, "I don't have the energy to correct you." That skill followed me into adulthood. At work, managers praised my composure. In relationships, partners said I was easy to be with, then seemed confused when I eventually pulled away. The pattern was so consistent, I assumed it was just my personality. I didn't see it as invisibility back then. I saw it as maturity. But maturity, when it's one-sided, turns into silence. And silence, when it's expected, becomes a rule you're punished for breaking. The truth is, I didn't feel invisible because no one could see me. I felt invisible because no one needed to. The version of me they interacted with required nothing from them. And as long as I stayed in that role, reliable, calm, undemanding, I belonged. What I didn't understand yet was that belonging without being heard comes with a quiet cost. One you don't notice until the moment you finally speak and realize no one was listening in the first place. The first moment that stayed with me didn't look like a turning point. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors. No harsh words that would replay themselves years later. That's why it was easy for everyone else to forget and impossible for me to do the same. We were on the phone. I remember that clearly because I was standing by my kitchen window, watching rain slide down the glass in thin, uneven lines. My father had called to ask for help with something practical. Paperwork, I think. He always called me for those things. I listened, asked questions, and took mental notes. At some point, I mentioned, carefully, that the situation might be more complicated than he realized. I suggested a small change in approach. Not a challenge, just information. There was a pause on the line, then he laughed. Not cruelly, casually. The kind of laugh that says, "That's cute, but unnecessary." "You worry too much," he said. "I've been doing this kind of thing longer than you've been alive." It wasn't the words themselves. It was the finality in his tone. The way the conversation moved on immediately afterward was as if my input had been a brief interruption rather than part of the discussion. I remember opening my mouth to respond and then closing it again. Something in me registered the moment like a small internal click. Not anger, not hurt, more like data being logged. This is how this works, I thought. This is where my input ends. The call continued. We talked about logistics. We ended the conversation politely. He thanked me for my help. I said, "Of course." My voice sounded normal, even warm. After I hung up, I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the rain. I felt a strange urge to rewind the conversation, to find a version of myself that had insisted, gently, reasonably, on being heard. But the urge passed. It always did. I told myself it wasn't worth making things awkward. That was the first cut, not because it hurt deeply, but because it taught me something. It taught me that my role was to support, not to contribute. That I was welcome as long as I stayed within the boundaries already drawn for me. When I brought it up later, casually, in a conversation with my mother, she waved it off. "That's just how your father is," she said. "You know he doesn't mean anything by it." I nodded. I always nodded. Friends would have said the same thing. Pick your battles. He's set in his ways. It's not personal. But it was personal in the quiet way that accumulates. From that point on, I noticed more things. Not because they were new, but because I had learned what to look for. The way my suggestions were acknowledged and then ignored. The way my accomplishments were mentioned was briefly, then overshadowed by someone else's story. The way conversations pivoted away from my experiences as soon as they became emotionally inconvenient. No one else seemed bothered by it. That made it easier to doubt myself. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe this was just family dynamics. Maybe expecting to be fully heard was unrealistic. So I adapted. Again, I started pre-editing my thoughts before sharing them. I softened opinions into observations. I framed concerns as questions, then let them drop when they weren't picked up. I became very good at speaking in ways that left no trace. On the surface, nothing changed. Our relationship looked the same, regular calls, polite exchanges, occasional laughter, but something subtle had shifted in me. I stopped expecting depth, and when you stop expecting something, you stop preparing for it. You don't bring your full attention. You don't risk saying the thing that matters most. You conserve energy by staying on safe ground. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar visibly. It simply reduced the range of motion. I didn't know then how many more of those cuts would follow. I only knew that a line had been drawn, quietly, invisibly, and that I had stepped back from it without saying a word. Once you accept a pattern, it stops announcing itself. That's the most dangerous part. What begins as a single moment slowly becomes background noise. You don't flinch anymore. You don't even register it as disrespect. You tell yourself it's just how things are, the way gravity works, whether you believe in it or not. With my father, the dismissals became so consistent that they lost their edges. If I shared a concern, he'd counter with experience. If I offered a different perspective, he'd reframe it as unnecessary worry. If I spoke about how something made me feel, he'd redirect the conversation to how difficult things had been for him. There was never an apology because there was never, in his mind, an offense. I learned to anticipate the outcome before opening my mouth. That's when I started doing the math internally. Is this worth the effort? Will anything change if I say this? Most of the time, the answer was no. So I stayed quiet and congratulated myself on being mature. I even defended him, to myself and to others. He doesn't communicate emotionally, I'd say. He shows love differently. He grew up in a time when feelings weren't discussed. Those explanations became a script I repeated until it sounded like the truth. And in some ways it was. But it wasn't the whole truth. The part I left out was how lonely it feels to be understood only in theory, never in practice. What surprised me most was how easy it became. Silence is addictive when it's rewarded. Every time I chose not to push, the conversation stayed calm. No tension, no awkwardness, peace, at least on the surface. And peace, when you've been trained to preserve it, can feel like love. I noticed the shift most clearly during family gatherings. I'd sit at the table, listening as conversations flowed around me. When I spoke, there was often a brief pause, just long enough to acknowledge my presence. Before the topic moved on without incorporating what I'd said, I started timing myself, not consciously at first, just noticing that my contributions were shorter and safer, facts instead of feelings, neutral observations instead of opinions. It wasn't that I had nothing to say. It was what I had learned, saying it didn't matter. The strange thing is, no one asked why I'd become quieter. They seemed to prefer me that way. I was easy to have around. I didn't disrupt the mood. I didn't require adjustment. And because I was still physically present, still calling, still showing up, it never occurred to anyone that something was eroding, including me. I told myself this was adulthood. Those relationships mellow with time. That intensity fades, and what's left is a practical connection. I mistook emotional distance for stability. But there's a cost to constantly minimizing yourself. It doesn't show up all at once. It shows up as a dull exhaustion, a feeling of being slightly misaligned in your own life. I'd hang up the phone after talking to my father and feel inexplicably tired, not upset, not sad, just drained, as if I'd spent energy bracing for something that never quite happened. Sometimes, late at night, I'd replay conversations in my head, not to argue, but to imagine what it would sound like if I had spoken freely, if I had said, "That matters to me," or "Please don't dismiss that." The imagined versions always ended the same way, with silence on the other end, or deflection. So I stopped imagining. That's how normalization works. You don't decide to accept less. You slowly forget what more felt like. The danger isn't that others cross your boundaries. It's that you quietly move them inward to avoid conflict. You make yourself smaller, more efficient, and easier to overlook. By the time you notice, the line is so close to you that stepping back feels like confrontation. I didn't see any of this as disrespect at the time. That word felt too strong. Disrespect implies intent. I told myself there was none. What I didn't understand yet was that impact doesn't require intention. Being unheard still reshapes you, even if no one meant for it to. And once you normalize that feeling, once you decide it's just part of the relationship, you also normalize the idea that your voice is optional. That belief settled into me quietly, comfortably, and it stayed there until something else, something I couldn't rationalize away, forced me to look at it directly. I didn't choose my role in the family. It was handed to me so early, so subtly, that by the time I noticed it, it felt permanent. I was the reliable one, the fixer, the person you called when something needed to be handled quietly and efficiently. If plans changed, I adapted. If someone forgot, I remembered for them. If emotions ran high, I absorbed the overflow. No one ever said, "This is what we expect from you." They didn't have to. Expectations reveal themselves through repetition. When my father needed help understanding a form, he called me. When there was tension between relatives, I was asked to smooth it over. When something went wrong, I was expected to understand why, and not make it worse. Understanding became my currency. I was praised for being level-headed and strong and not emotional like the others. Each compliment reinforced the same message. Don't need too much, don't disrupt. I didn't realize at first that these traits weren't being admired. They were being used. The role came with rules. I could give, but not ask. I could listen, but not require listening in return. I could show up, but only in ways that made things easier for everyone else. Anytime I stepped outside that role, even slightly, the reaction was see-through confusion. Is something wrong? You're taking this too personally. That's not like you. Those comments weren't a concern. They were correct. My father enforced the role without ever naming it. When I spoke calmly, he was comfortable. When I challenged something, still calmly, he grew distant, impatient, not angry, just closed. So I learned what kept the door open. I remember one particular evening when it clicked for me. We were discussing a family decision that affected me directly. I offered a perspective rooted in my own experience. He listened, nodded, and then proceeded as if I hadn't spoken at all. Later, when I gently asked if my input had been considered, he looked genuinely surprised. "I thought you were just thinking out loud," he said. That sentence settled heavily in me, thinking out loud, as if my words were ambient noise, as if my thoughts didn't require a response, because they weren't meant to shape anything. In that moment, I understood something with startling clarity. My role was not participant. It was support staff. Once you see the role, you can't unsee it. I started noticing how often my presence functioned as reassurance for others. As long as I was there, calm, agreeable, everything felt stable. My father especially seemed to rely on that stability without ever checking what it cost me. And I let him, because stepping out of the role would mean creating friction. It would mean asking to be seen differently. It would mean risking the one thing I had always been careful to preserve: peace. But peace built on one person's silence is fragile. It holds only as long as that person keeps swallowing their discomfort. I didn't resent my father then. Not consciously. I told myself this was just how families worked. Everyone had a function. This was mine. What I didn't realize was that roles don't just define how others treat you. They define how you treat yourself. I stopped expecting my feelings to be centered. I stopped offering parts of myself that might require care. I showed up already edited, already contained. And the more consistently I did that, the more permanent the role became. The dangerous thing about being reliable is that people stop imagining you might ever leave. They assume you'll always answer the phone, always understand, always be there in the same way you've always been. Even you start to believe it. I believed it. Right up until the moment something inside me quietly refused to continue playing its part. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no confrontation, no clear reason I could point to afterward and say, "That's when it changed." It was ordinary. I was sitting alone in my car, parked outside my apartment, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, long after I'd arrived. The radio had gone silent. My phone was face down on the passenger seat. I had just finished another call with my father. Nothing bad had happened during that conversation. That was the problem. He had talked. I had listened. He had vented about a situation at work, about how no one appreciated his experience, how frustrating it was to feel unheard. I offered empathy. I asked thoughtful questions. I mirrored his feelings back to him, the way I always did. At one point, he paused and said, "You're good at this. You always understand." Something in me tightened, not because it was unkind, because it was accurate in the most uncomfortable way. I did understand. I understood so well that I had erased myself from the equation. I was fluent in his emotional language while my own remained untranslated, even to me. When the call ended, I didn't immediately move. I sat there, noticing how familiar the fatigue felt. That dull, low-grade heaviness in my chest. The sense that I had given something without quite knowing what I'd received in return. For the first time, I didn't brush it away. I didn't tell myself I was being dramatic. I didn't rationalize it. I just stayed with the feeling, curious instead of dismissive. And a quiet question surfaced, one I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. When was the last time he tried to understand me? I searched my memory, not accusingly, just honestly. Moments floated up, conversations redirected, feelings minimized, experiences reframed through his perspective. I realized how rarely he asked follow-up questions about my life unless they related to logistics or outcomes. I had known this intellectually, but knowing something and feeling it are different experiences. That was the shift. Not anger, not resentment, clarity. I saw the dynamic without excuses for the first time. Saw how much emotional labor I'd been performing and how little curiosity had been extended back toward me. I didn't confront him. I didn't rehearse a speech. I haven't even decided to change anything yet. All that happened was this. I stopped automatically volunteering my inner world. The next time we spoke, I answered his questions, but briefly. I listened, but I didn't expand. When there was a pause, where I would normally fill the silence, I let it remain. He didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't comment. And that told me something else. The dynamic didn't depend on my silence because he needed it. It depended on my silence because it was convenient. That realization settled slowly, like dust in still air. Over the next few weeks, I paid attention. Not to him, but to myself. To the small impulses I usually ignored. The moments where I felt the urge to explain, to justify, to smooth. Each time I paused, not to punish anyone, just to observe what happened if I didn't step into the role automatically. What happened was nothing. Conversations continued, plans were made, life went on, and that was unsettling. It meant my constant effort hadn't been holding everything together the way I'd believed. It meant the peace I'd been protecting wasn't as fragile as I'd feared. Or maybe it wasn't peace at all. That car, that moment of stillness, became a quiet reference point for me, a before and after that no one else could see. I didn't feel empowered. I felt sobered. Because once you see a dynamic clearly, you're responsible for what you do next. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to innocence. I knew then that continuing as I had been would require an active choice. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to make it. Something had shifted. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction of everything that followed. There's a difference between being quiet because you're afraid to speak and being quiet because you're choosing not to. I didn't recognize the difference at first. The behavior looked the same from the outside. I still answered calls. I still showed up. I still listened. But internally, something had shifted position. Before, my silence had been reflexive, automatic, a way to avoid discomfort before it even surfaces. Now it was deliberate. I started noticing the moments where I could step in and deciding not to. When my father began the familiar monologue about how no one listened to him, I didn't rush to reassure him. I let him finish. When there was a pause, I didn't immediately validate or translate his feelings into something more palatable. I simply acknowledged, "That sounds frustrating," and stopped there. He often waited, as if expecting more. I let the silence sit. At first, it felt wrong, like withholding, like I was failing at something I'd trained myself to do well. I had to sit on my hands, literally sometimes, to keep from filling the space. But nothing terrible happened. He continued talking, or he changed the subject, or the call ended slightly earlier than usual. Life went on. What changed was how I felt afterward. I was less drained, less hollow, not lighter exactly, but more intact. Silence, when it's chosen, becomes a boundary. It says, "This is as far as I go. This is what I offer." Others don't always recognize it as such. They often interpret it as compliance or indifference. My father seemed to interpret it as agreement. I noticed that he began to assume my alignment more than ever. He'd say things like, "You know what I mean," or "You get it." Without checking if I did in the past, I would have corrected him gently if I didn't. Now I didn't. That wasn't manipulation. It was information gathering. I was learning how much of our connection was built on my active participation, and how little effort was required from him clarified everything. The more I withheld my emotional labor, the clearer the imbalance became. What surprised me most was how invisible the change was to everyone else. No one commented on my quieter tone. No one asked if something was wrong. The role still fit me well enough that small deviations didn't register. That invisibility used to hurt. Now it taught me something useful. It meant I could move without triggering alarms. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't justify them. I simply stopped crossing my own. When he interrupted me, I didn't rush to finish my thought later. I let it drop. When he dismissed a concern, I didn't circle back to clarify. I noted it and moved on. When conversations stayed surface level, I stopped trying to deepen them alone. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing. To me, it felt like reclaiming small pieces of myself. There was a quiet confidence in knowing I wasn't required to be understood to be valid, that I didn't have to make my inner world accessible to someone who hadn't shown interest in entering it. Of course, there were moments of doubt. Was I being passive-aggressive? Was I punishing him silently? Was I overreacting to something that didn't deserve this level of withdrawal? Each time I returned to the same question. Does speaking change anything here? The honest answer remained no. Silence, then, wasn't avoidance. It was accurate. I was matching the level of engagement that actually existed, not the one I'd been pretending was there. And here's the thing, no one tells you. When you stop over-functioning in a relationship, the imbalance doesn't disappear. It becomes visible. That visibility can be uncomfortable, for you and eventually for them. But at this stage, my father hadn't noticed. Or if he hadn't interpreted it as a shift. The structure of our relationship still worked for him. I was still there, still reliable, still calm, just no longer giving more than I had. That's what made the next phase possible. Because when silence becomes a choice, it creates space. And in that space, you can finally see what's really happening without interference, without excuses. I didn't know yet what I would do with that clarity. I only knew I wasn't willing to give it back. What they never noticed was not the silence itself, but what filled the space it left behind. When I stopped rushing to explain myself, to smooth things over, to emotionally anticipate everyone else, I didn't become empty. I became observant. Energy doesn't disappear when you stop spending it. It reallocates. I began paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not with suspicion, with precision. I noticed how conversations followed predictable paths. How my father spoke to people, not with them. How he interpreted agreement even when none was offered. How quickly he grew uncomfortable when there was no emotional cushioning beneath his words. I also noticed myself, how often I had overridden my instincts to maintain harmony. How often I had said yes when my body said no. How skilled I was at emotional translation. and how rarely anyone asked me to speak in my own language. None of this felt dramatic. It felt almost administrative, like taking inventory after realizing you've been miscounting for years. I started documenting, not in a literal notebook, but internally. Patterns, timing, reactions. When I didn't offer reassurance, he repeated himself. When I didn't agree, he assumed agreement anyway. When I didn't engage emotionally, he lost interest faster. That last part stayed with me. It told me something important. The connection wasn't sustained by mutual curiosity. It was sustained by my participation. And participation, I was learning, is optional. Around the same time, I began strengthening other areas of my life quietly. Not as an escape, but as a recalibration. I invested more fully in my work. Not by working longer hours, but by working with clearer boundaries. I let my competence speak without explanation. I stopped volunteering for emotional cleanup roles, both professionally and personally. I noticed how often people step forward when you step back. How systems adjust, how absence reveals what presence concealed. With friends, I tested small truths. I spoke plainly instead of diplomatically. The ones who listened stayed. The ones who preferred the edited version drifted. That data mattered. I wasn't isolating myself. I was refining my environment. All the while, my father remained unaware. Our calls continued, just slightly shorter. Our exchanges remained polite. There was no conflict to point to, no rupture. That's why what happened later shocked everyone else. They thought nothing had changed. But change doesn't always announce itself with raised voices. Sometimes it happens the way foundations settle, quietly, invisibly, until the structure above can no longer rely on what it assumed was there. I realized something else during this period. I had leverage, not in the manipulative sense, not in a transactional way, but in the simplest, most overlooked form. I had access. I was the one who answered, the one who listened, the one who made space, and I was no longer doing that automatically. That awareness didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel careful, because leverage carries responsibility. Once you see it, you have to decide how to use it, or whether to use it at all. I didn't plan anything. I didn't rehearse outcomes. I didn't imagine confrontations. I simply kept observing. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that my silence was being misread, not as a boundary, but as stability. They believed the version of me they were accustomed to would always be available, that my role was fixed, that my presence was guaranteed. They never noticed the preparation happening beneath the surface, because preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like learning when not to respond, like understanding the difference between connection and obligation. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to choose. And that distinction matters more than it sounds, because when a choice finally presents itself, one you can undo, you don't rise to the occasion. You act from the position you've already built. What they never noticed was that I had been building that position quietly, patiently, without anyone's permission. And by the time the moment arrived, there was no urgency left in me, only clarity. The reveal wasn't a discovery in the cinematic sense. There was no single document, no overheard conversation, no dramatic piece of information that changed everything at once. It was quieter than that. It came in the form of an understanding I had been circling for months without naming. One evening, after a call with my father ended sooner than usual, I sat on my couch and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not the kind that follows resolution, but the kind that follows distance. The absence of tension where there used to be obligation. That's when it became undeniable. I wasn't afraid of losing the relationship. I had already lost the version of it that mattered to me. What I had been protecting all those years wasn't connection. It was continuity. The idea that as long as the line stayed open, something meaningful might still pass through it. But nothing had been passing through for a long time. That was the private reveal. The relationship existed primarily because I maintained it. Not emotionally, logistically, habitually, out of identity, not desire. And once I saw that clearly, the leverage revealed itself without fanfare. I controlled the access point. Not his behavior, not his understanding, just my availability. I realized that my presence had functioned as reassurance for him, for the family, for the story everyone told themselves about us. As long as I was there, everything felt intact. My calmness had been mistaken for consent. This wasn't empowering, it was sobering. Because leverage isn't about domination, it's about responsibility. It forces you to ask, what happens if I stop? I didn't test it right away. I didn't need to. I already knew the answer. I had seen how quickly conversations lost depth without my engagement, how silence unsettled him, even if he didn't name it, how much he relied on my quiet agreement to feel validated. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me sad in a clean, contained way, because it meant the imbalance wasn't accidental anymore, not once I could see it. It meant that continuing as before would be a choice I was actively making, not a default I could excuse. And once something becomes a choice, it carries weight. I sat with that for a long time. Days, weeks, letting the truth exist without acting on it. I didn't want to weaponize it. I didn't want to punish him for not being someone he'd never claimed to be. But I also couldn't unknow it. The private reveal wasn't about him, ultimately. It was about me. I had been loyal to a role longer than it served either of us. Loyal to peace over truth, to stability over reciprocity. And I was tired. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way you're tired when you realize rest will require change. I began imagining futures, not in detail but in feeling. One where nothing changed. One where I spoke openly and was dismissed again. One where I slowly withdrew and let the connection thin on its own. None of them felt clean. What felt clean was honesty. Quiet honesty without speeches or demands. Honesty with myself about what I could and could not continue offering. The reveal crystallized something I had avoided naming. I didn't owe perpetual access to anyone who didn't meet me with curiosity. That wasn't cruelty, it was proportion. Still, I didn't act, not yet, because knowing your leverage doesn't mean you rush to use it. Sometimes it simply informs how carefully you move. I continued answering calls. I continued being polite. But internally, something had shifted from patience to preparedness. I was no longer waiting for understanding. I was preparing for the moment when a line would be crossed. Not dramatically, not intentionally, but finally. The kind of moment you don't plan for, but recognize instantly when it arrives. And when it did, I wouldn't be reacting from anger. I would be responding from clarity. That was the private reveal. No celebration, no sense of victory, just the quiet certainty that the next decision would matter. And that once made, it would not ask permission to be undone. The decision point didn't feel heavy when it arrived. That surprised me most. I had imagined, if it ever came, that it would feel charged, emotional, like standing at the edge of something irreversible with my heart racing, instincts flaring, old wounds demanding to be acknowledged. Instead, it felt quiet, ordinary, almost inconvenient. It was another phone call. I remember because I had almost let it go to voicemail. Not out of avoidance, just because I was tired and didn't feel like talking, but I answered, out of habit more than intention. My father was already frustrated when the call began. I could hear it in the way he spoke, clipped and compressed, as if the conversation was something he needed to get through rather than engage in. He launched into a familiar grievance. Someone had disappointed him. Someone hadn't listened. The details blurred together, but the pattern was intact. I listened, not automatically, attentively. At some point, I offered a thought, a measured one. I wasn't trying to challenge him. I wasn't emotional. I simply said that maybe the situation wasn't as one-sided as it felt, that there might be another interpretation worth considering. There was a pause. Then he cut me off. Not sharply, not angrily, just decisively. No, he said, that's not what's happening. And he continued speaking as if I hadn't said anything at all. Something in me recognized the moment immediately, not because it was new, but because it was final. I felt a brief flicker of anger, not rage, not hurt, just a quick, clean surge of heat, the kind that comes when something crosses a line you didn't know was still there. For 5 minutes, I was angry. In those 5 minutes, I saw everything clearly at once. The years of minimization, the unreturned curiosity, the way my calmness had been used as a blank check. I could feel the old reflex rising, explain, soften, rephrase, make him understand. And then something else intervened. A calm, steady thought, I don't have to do this anymore. He was still talking. I looked at the wall in front of me, not in dissociation, indecision. I didn't interrupt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't announce anything. I simply said, I'm going to hang up now. There was a split second of silence, just long enough to register surprise. Then I ended the call. That was it. No speech, no warning, no follow-up message. I sat there afterward, phone in my hand, breathing evenly. My heart wasn't pounding. My hands weren't shaking. I told myself it was the pause, that I would call back later, that this was just space. But somewhere underneath that thought, something deeper had already settled. The decision had been made, not to punish him, not to teach a lesson, but to stop participating in a dynamic that required my erasure. The anger passed quickly. Within minutes, it dissolved into something quieter, an uneasy stillness, a sense of stepping into a room and realizing the door had closed behind you without a sound. I didn't feel relief, not yet. I felt the weight of finality without fully understanding its shape. That night, I went to bed as usual. No tears, no rehearsed explanations, just a faint, persistent awareness that something had shifted permanently. The next day, there was no call from him. The day after that, nothing. I didn't reach out. Not because I was committed to silence, but because I was waiting to see what I felt when I wasn't actively holding the connection together. What I felt was absence, and absence once noticed is impossible to ignore. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like power. It felt like accuracy. I had responded to the situation as it was, not as I wished it could be. And while I didn't yet understand the full consequences of that choice, I understood one thing clearly. There are moments when continuing a conversation costs more than ending it. And once you recognize that moment, you don't see the relationship the same way again. After I hung up, nothing exploded. That's important to say. No barrage of messages, no frantic calls, no immediate fallout that would have justified the weight I felt settling into my chest. The world didn't react the way dramatic stories teach us to expect. It's continued. The first few days passed quietly. I went to work. I answered emails. I made dinner. Life maintained its shape, and that normalcy felt unsettling. I kept waiting for the moment when I'd feel compelled to explain myself, to smooth things over, to repair what I'd interrupted. But that impulse didn't come. Instead, I noticed something else, how much energy it took not to reach out. Not because I missed the conversation, but because I had been conditioned to be the one who reopens doors. That urge was a habit, not a longing. So I let the silence stand. Moving in silence doesn't mean being passive. It means making internal decisions without announcing them. It means allowing space to exist long enough for truth to surface on its own. I didn't declare boundaries. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't frame it as a statement. I just stopped initiating. When days turned into weeks, the absence grew noticeable. Not to everyone, but to me. I observed how my body responded, how the tension I used to carry around our interactions slowly eased, how evenings felt longer, how my thoughts no longer revolved around preparing for the next call. I also noticed what didn't happen. No curiosity from him, no message asking why I'd hung up, no attempt to revisit the conversation. That absence of response was information. If I had still doubted the imbalance, this confirmed it. The connection had depended on my consistency more than his concern. Still, I didn't act out of spite. I didn't block numbers or draw dramatic lines. I simply allowed the relationship to exist at the level it was being sustained from the other side, which, it turned out, was minimal. There's a strange discomfort that comes with not filling the silence. It exposes how much you've been managing without realizing it. How much of normal was actually effort? I began quietly adjusting my life around that truth. I redirected my emotional availability toward places where it was reciprocated. I invested more deeply in friendships that felt mutual. I let conversations unfold without rescuing them. At work, I stopped absorbing responsibilities that weren't mine. I said no without explanation, and nothing collapsed. This phase wasn't about withdrawal. It was about redistribution. No one noticed the change immediately because I didn't make it visible. There were no announcements, no confrontations. To the outside world, I was the same calm, reliable person. But internally, I had stopped compensating. And that's when the consequences began. Slowly, quietly, without spectacle. I heard through others that my father was frustrated, that he felt out of the loop, that he didn't understand why I seemed distant. He never asked me directly. That, too, was in Berman. Moving in silence taught me something I hadn't expected. Closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from behavior that's allowed to speak for itself. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was letting one land naturally. Each day that passed without contact made the choice feel less reactive and more real. The anger from that phone call faded completely. What remained was a sober awareness of consequence. Because silence isn't neutral when it replaces a role you've played for years. It changes the system by removing a support beam no one realized was load-bearing. I didn't yet know how far-reaching that change would be. I only knew that by not stepping back into the role automatically, I had altered the structure permanently. And structures, once shifted, don't return to their original shape just because someone wants them to. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. A question passed through someone else. A comment made in passing. Have you talked to your dad lately? He mentioned he hasn't heard from you. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was puzzled, as if a familiar pattern had glitched and no one knew why. I answered neutrally. Not recently. No explanation, no defense. That neutrality unsettled people more than anger would have, because anger fits a story, silence doesn't. My father, I learned, was unsettled too. Not openly, not enough to reach out directly, but enough to mention it to others. He framed it the way he framed most things that didn't make sense to him, as external disruption. She's busy. She's probably stressed. She'll call when things settle down. He assumed the distance was temporary, circumstantial. Something is happening to me, not something I had chosen. That assumption mattered. It meant he hadn't asked himself why the silence existed, only when it would end. As weeks passed, the absence started to create practical gaps. Information that used to flow through me no longer does. Updates were missed, decisions were made without my input, and then delayed because no one had anticipated the follow-up questions I usually handled. Small inefficiencies surfaced, nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to be noticed. And still, no one connected it to my absence. That's the thing about quiet roles. When you perform them well, people don't see the work. They only feel its absence when it's gone. I could sense the system straining, not breaking, just adjusting poorly. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this happen. I felt a muted sadness, because it confirmed what I already knew. My presence had been functional more than relational. I wasn't missed as a person. I was missed as a process. That realization stung in a very specific way. Not sharply, not dramatically, just deeply. My father's frustration, I heard, had turned inward, but not introspective. He was irritated with the circumstances, with timing, with other people. Anyone but me. I waited. Not to punish, to see whether curiosity would surface. It didn't. What surfaced was the inconvenience. And inconvenience is often the first thing people feel when they lose something they assumed would always be there. One afternoon, I received a message from a relative asking if I could check in on him. The implication was gentle, but clear. This is your role. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I replied, I'm sure he'll reach out if he wants to talk. That was all. I didn't feel empowered sending it. I felt resolved, because stepping back had clarified something I couldn't have seen otherwise. My silence was being treated as a malfunction, not a boundary. No one was asking what had changed. They were waiting for me to fix it. And for the first time, I didn't. The consequences continued unfolding quietly. Family conversations shifted tone. My name came up with uncertainty instead of assumption. Plans were made without me, then awkwardly adjusted when someone realized I hadn't been consulted. I was no longer the default. That loss of default status was more destabilizing than any argument would have been. For them. For me, it was grounding, because it meant the relationship had finally moved out of autopilot. Even if no one had acknowledged it yet, the old structure no longer held. I didn't know then how far this would go. I didn't yet understand that some opportunities for repair have expiration dates. Not because of anger, but because of timing. All I knew was this. Once people experience the consequences of your absence, they either seek understanding or they seek restoration of convenience. And the difference between those two responses tells you everything you need to know. By the time concern appeared, it arrived tangled with urgency. Not understanding urgency, it came indirectly, the way most things had begun to come now. A message passed through someone else. A suggestion that maybe I should clear the air. A reminder that my father wasn't getting any younger. That last one landed differently, because it wasn't new information. It was leverage disguised as concern. For the first time since the call, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, fear. The old reflex stirred. Don't let this go too far. Don't make this permanent. I sat with that feeling carefully. I asked myself a question I hadn't asked before. What would fixing it actually require? The honest answer was uncomfortable. It would require me to resume my role, to explain myself gently, to soften the impact of his dismissal, to reassure him that nothing fundamental had changed, even though it had. Fixing it would mean pretending the hang-up was an overreaction, rather than a boundary reached after years of quiet compromise. And I couldn't do that anymore. Still, doubt crept in. I imagined a version of the conversation where I called him, where we talked it through calmly, where he listened this time, where he said something like, I didn't realize, I'm sorry. That version felt soothing, but also implausible. I hadn't cut contact dramatically. I hadn't blocked him. The door wasn't slammed. If he wanted to understand, he could have knocked. He didn't. Instead, the pressure increased. I was told he was confused, that he felt hurt, that he didn't know what he'd done wrong. Those statements were true and incomplete. He didn't know because he hadn't asked. Because in our history, my discomfort had always been managed silently, absorbed without requiring his attention. He was experiencing the consequences of a pattern he had never needed to examine, and I was being asked to resolve that discomfort for him. That's when I realized something irreversible had already happened. Even if I reached out now, it wouldn't be repaired. It would be a reversal, a return to the old equilibrium where my clarity was exchanged for his comfort. And I knew, deeply, quietly, that I wouldn't survive that trade a second time. The hardest part wasn't the silence. It was the waiting. Waiting to see if curiosity would appear, if accountability were to surface without prompting, if he were to say, I don't understand what happened, but I want to. He never did. Instead, time passed. Weeks turned into months. The urgency softened into resignation. The suggestions to fix it became less frequent, then stopped. People adjusted, and that adjustment carried its own grief, because it meant the opportunity for a different outcome had closed, not with a bang, but with a fade. I understood then why some things can't be fixed after a certain point, not because they're broken beyond repair, but because the conditions for repair are gone. Repair requires mutual willingness, mutual effort, mutual humility. What remained was asymmetry. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt older. I began to understand regret, not as self-blame, but as the cost of delayed honesty. There were moments I wished I had spoken sooner, moments I wondered if 5 minutes of anger had outweighed years of restraint. In between moments, I replayed that hang-up and imagined saying one more sentence before ending the call. But those thoughts didn't change the truth. The truth was that the relationship had been running on borrowed time long before that call. The hang-up didn't end it, it revealed it. And by the time anyone tried to fix it, they weren't trying to understand what had been lost. They were trying to restore what had been convenient. That distinction matters, because not all regret means you made the wrong choice. Sometimes it means the right choice came with a loss you didn't fully anticipate. And once you see that clearly, there's no way back, only forward, carrying both the clarity and the weight it came with. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't the kind of confrontation people imagine. There was no raised voice, no rehearsed speech, no moment where everything spilled out at once and left the room scorched. It happened quietly, almost accidentally. Months had passed, enough time for the absence to become familiar, enough time for my internal position to feel settled rather than reactive. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't waiting. I was steady. The message came first, short, practical, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Can we talk?" I didn't respond right away, not to assert control, but to check myself, to make sure I wasn't answering from habit or fear or hope. When I did agree, we spoke on the phone. Not because it was easier, because it was honest. His voice sounded the same, confident, slightly guarded, as if this conversation was a task to complete rather than a space to enter. He started by saying he didn't understand what had happened, that he felt shut out, that the hang-up had been unnecessary. I listened, not with the old attentiveness that searched for reassurance to offer, but with clarity. I let him finish without interruption. I noticed how his explanation centered on his confusion, his discomfort, and his sense of being wronged. When he stopped, there was a pause. In the past, I would have filled it, softened things, reframed, taken responsibility for the emotional temperature of the room. This time I didn't. I said calmly, "I didn't hang up to hurt you. I hung up because I realized I wasn't being heard, and I couldn't continue the conversation as it was." That was it. No list of grievances, no emotional history lesson, no attempt to convince him. He responded with defensiveness. Not explosive, just firm. He said he'd always done his best, that he didn't see things the way I did, that he felt blindsided. I didn't argue. "I believe you," I said, "and I also believe my experience." That sentence changed the tone more than anything else could have, because it didn't ask him to agree. It didn't accuse him of intent. It simply refused to invalidate me. There was a long silence. In that silence, I felt something I hadn't expected. Sadness without urgency. Compassion without self-erasure. I told him, briefly, that I'd spent years making myself easier to hear by saying less. That the hang-up wasn't about that one moment, but about realizing I no longer wanted to participate in conversations where my presence required my disappearance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand change. I stated a boundary, not as a threat, but as information. He didn't respond the way people hope for in these stories. There was no sudden understanding, no emotional breakthrough. He said he needed time. I said I understood. And for the first time in our relationship, that was true in a balanced way. The call ended politely, almost formally. When it was over, I didn't feel closure in the cinematic sense. I felt alignment. The confrontation hadn't been about winning or being validated. It had been about showing up fully, without armor, without retreat. And regardless of what happened next, I knew I hadn't abandoned myself in that conversation. That mattered more than the outcome. Because sometimes the quietest confrontation is the one where you no longer fight to be understood, only to be honest. And honesty, when delivered without heat, has a way of standing on its own. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of how it ended. I tell it because it changed how I live. Who I am now isn't defined by distance or by defiance. It's defined by proportion, by giving only what I can give without losing myself. After that conversation, things didn't resolve neatly. We didn't rebuild something new, and we didn't formally end what had existed. The relationship settled into a quieter, more limited shape. Occasional updates, polite exchanges, fewer assumptions. It's not the relationship I once hoped for, but it's honest. What changed most profoundly wasn't my connection to my father. It was my relationship with myself. I no longer confuse calm with obligation. I no longer believe that being easy is a virtue if it costs me my voice. I've learned that silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen, not imposed. I'm still the person people describe as steady. I still listen well. I still value peace. But I no longer earn peace by disappearing. In my work, I speak when something matters, even if my voice shakes slightly. I don't pre-edit myself to fit expectations. I allow disagreement without treating it as failure. In my personal life, I pay attention to reciprocity. Not in a transactional way, but in an energetic one. If I'm the only one holding space, I notice. If curiosity doesn't travel both directions, I don't chase it. That doesn't mean I'm closed. It means I'm selective. I often think about those 5 minutes of anger, how small it was, how permanent it felt afterward, how many years of regret it carried with it. And here's the truth I had to learn slowly. Regret doesn't always mean you were wrong. Sometimes it means the cost of self-respect is real. I regret the finality of that moment. I regret not finding words sooner when there was more room for them to land. I regret assuming time would always be available, but I don't regret choosing not to betray myself again. Both things can exist at once. That's adulthood, not certainty, but complexity, held with care. If I could speak to my younger self, I wouldn't tell her to speak louder or fight harder. I'd tell her to notice sooner, to trust the quiet signals before they require dramatic action. And if I could speak to my father again in that moment, I wouldn't change the outcome. I'd change the lead up. I'd stop shrinking years earlier. Who I am now is someone who understands that relationships don't end in one moment. They end in a series of small decisions, most of them invisible at the time. I carry that understanding with me. It informs how I show up, how I listen, and how I leave. There's no bitterness here, just a sober respect for consequence. And a commitment to myself to never again confuse endurance with love. There are moments in life that don't feel important when they happen. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with music or warning. They slip into existence quietly, wearing the disguise of the ordinary. And years later, you realize they were crossroads. The day I hung up on my father lasted only seconds. The anger that fueled it lasted maybe 5 minutes. The consequences of it, both the clarity and the regret, have lasted much longer. I've learned that regret is not always a sign that you made the wrong decision. Sometimes it's the echo of a decision that finally tells the truth. What I regret most is not the boundary itself. It's the silence that came before it. The years I spent editing myself so thoroughly that the only way out left no room for softness. When you stay quiet for too long, your voice doesn't disappear. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it doesn't always do so gently. That's the part I carry with me. I carry the understanding that relationships are not sustained by intention alone. They are sustained by attention, by curiosity, by the willingness to hear something that might be inconvenient. Love without listening is fragile. It can exist for years, even decades, but it collapses the moment one person stops holding it up alone. If there's a moral here, it's not cut people off or always speak your mind. It's simpler and harder. Don't trade honesty for harmony so long that honesty has no place left to land. Because one day, you may find yourself choosing between silence that erases you and words that arrive too late to repair what they reveal. And that choice will change you. I'm not sharing this story to warn you away from anger. Anger is information. It tells you where a line exists, but it's not meant to carry the full weight of truth by itself. If you're listening to this and thinking about someone you've been quiet with, someone you keep accommodating because it feels easier, I hope you don't wait for the breaking point to speak. Not because the breaking point is dramatic, but because it's irreversible. Some conversations can be postponed, some cannot. And sometimes the greatest act of care for yourself and for others is to speak while there's still time for the words to be received. I'll leave you with this, not as a lesson, but as an invitation. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace and later realized the cost of that silence? If you feel comfortable, share your experience in the comments. You never know who might recognize themselves in your story and choose to speak sooner because of it.